Welcome and good afternoon. I am Roberta Marcus, and I want to thank you for joining us today. We will be discussing issues on the Pennsylvania state budget and what it means for education funding, and how you can advocate for more investment in public education. We all know the cost drivers: special ed, PSERS, unfunded and underfunded mandates. And today, Sharon Ward of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center will give us a brief overview on the state's decision-making and its impact on education funding. Please note, we will be recording the presentation part only today, so it will be available at a later date for others. At the time we begin questions and answers, we would appreciate if you would identify yourself with your name and school district prior to asking your question. Thanks. And let's begin with Sharon Ward.
Great. Thanks so much, Roberta. I appreciate you joining on the call today, and also all of the advocacy that you do on behalf of Pennsylvania school districts and Pennsylvania school children. And thanks everybody for joining on the call this afternoon. And I'm going to try to move this, so let's see if I can do it. Oh, there we go. The Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and policy organization that is based in Harrisburg. You may have followed some of our work on the state budget. We work on the state budget and state tax policy with an eye towards the long term, and our focus is on issues of tax fairness and revenue sustainability that we believe is necessary to support public investments like education, infrastructure, healthcare, all of which are critical to our state's economy as well as being very important to its citizens. I'm going to give you, as Roberta said, I want to talk a little bit about state education funding and a little bit about the proposed budget for next year. But in the presentation today, I want to really make a couple of very important points, and some of them may be obvious, but I can assure you they're here for a reason. The first point that's going to be very important to make is that public education funding has been cut significantly in the for the 2011-12 fiscal year. And again, you might think this is an obvious point, but there are many in the General Assembly who continue to vigorously argue that there were not budget cuts and there were not state funding cuts. The second point that I want to make is that education was treated differently in a variety of ways. There were some cuts to state education funding during the recession, as there were to all programs, and in fact there were some areas that were really cut significantly, including economic development and the environment, actually. But during the later years, education has been treated differently, particularly in that the temporary federal funds that did go to education during the period of 2008 to 2011 were not restored with state dollars when those funds came to an end, and that similar temporary federal funding streams were restored with state dollars in other program areas. The third point I want to make is that there are a number of cost drivers for school district budgets. Roberta has mentioned several of them. Clearly, there are higher pension and personnel costs. There are state mandates. There are a number of things that are contributing to obviously what are great concerns at the school district level today. State budget cuts clearly have had an impact, but one thing that has also undermined and will continue to create problems for our long-term ability to fund public education is the state-level tax cuts that have been made over the past 15 years, but that have really accelerated and have really had a significant revenue impact during the last 10 years. A fourth point is that what are what are spending cuts and tax cuts at the state level end up as responsibility shifts, cost shifts, and tax increases to local governments and local taxpayers. And that's one of the main points we wanted to discuss today, how a state level tax cut ends up simply shifting responsibility onto local governments and leads to higher taxes at the local level. And then finally, there are some new threats to long-term education funding that we are worried about and would like to make you aware of. So let me get on to the next slide, if I can get this to move. Come on. Let's see if I can make this happen. There we go. I want to start again with something that you all know, but Pennsylvania's education funding problem is in fact a structural one. Our state contributes much less to public education than most other states, and we've looked at the new numbers that came out very recently that break out the share of total education funding from federal, state, and local sources, and you can see once again Pennsylvania is quite different from the national average. Pennsylvania ranks 47th in the state share of public education in 2011, and as you can see, the national average is 45%, while Pennsylvania's state share is about 34%. So this is a long-term trend. It is significant, and it certainly means that reductions in state-level funding really come on top of a system which is already less generous or takes less responsibility than is the case in most other states. There we go. Again, I want to talk a little bit about the classroom funding, and this slide looks not at total education spending over the 7-year period, but just at the dollars that go into the classroom. And you can see that the total spending went up in 2009, 2010, 2010, 11 as the state began to make additional contributions, increases in the basic education funding line to address what were identified as adequacy problems with across the school districts. Some of that was in fact paid for with federal dollars, and I can tell you that when the budget came out in 2009-10 and it didn't include an increase in education, basic education funding, it was funded with state dollars, and the decision to replace those state dollars with federal funds came very, very late in the process, and frankly was vigorously opposed by many of us in Harrisburg through June of that year. Again, the total funding declined in 2011-12 and has barely increased in 2012-13 and is projected to rise by a very small amount in 2013-14. So the next two slides really examine a couple of other budget areas that also received temporary federal funds between 2008 and 2011. So the first thing I want to talk about is the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. That was a federal program that provided dollars which states could use to support programs in a number of areas. One of them was obviously education, but states could also use it to prevent budget cuts in public safety and higher ed, and a couple of other areas. In Pennsylvania, these dollars were used in the higher education system, in public education, and corrections. And what you can see here is that the blue, or whatever color, I believe you probably are seeing blue, Federal Recovery Act or ARA dollars were completely replaced with state dollars in the 2011-12 budget. So a treatment that was very different from the treatment of public education. The same thing occurred in the Medicaid program, a second federal program that was part of the state fiscal relief that came through the Recovery Act in 2009, gave states additional dollars through their Medicaid programs. And those federal dollars were designed to free up state dollars that could be distributed to other areas of the budget in order to prevent budget cuts and prevent layoffs. If you look at the amounts beginning in 2008-9, they were very significant, more than $2 billion in the public welfare budget. In 2011-12, the bulk of those federal dollars were replaced with state dollars, and they were in probably 50 line items. And certainly by 2012-13, those funds were almost completely replaced with state dollars. Whoops, come back. There we go. So again, we want to look a little bit more about the impact of these funding cuts over time, and look at it in terms of real dollars. And what this slide shows you is what the state spending on public education and classroom funding has been since the 2007-8 period in 2013 dollars as a helpful way to look at the changes in purchasing power for state funding. So you can see that the top line is pre-K through 12 funding. Those dollars were reduced. The total funding was reduced in 2011-12, and in inflation-adjusted dollars gone up very slightly since that time. On the flip side, the classroom dollars, which are the bottom line, really just took a beating in 2010-11, and not only have not recovered, but in inflation-adjusted terms are actually below, are continuing to decline. Now again, this is not true everywhere in the state budget. In fact, education has had a particularly difficult time over the past number of years. And one of the things we wanted to do was show you a comparison between what's happened in the corrections budget and the special education line. We know that that has been a continuing problem. Special education has been level funded since 2008-9, and the real purchasing power has declined. So if you look at the difference in what that means in terms of the ability to provide, critical programs, corrections purchasing power has increased by about $135 million, while in real terms special education has taken a cut of about $104 million. There we go. So again, there are a number of factors that have contributed to cost increases at the school district level, clearly, but we think it's important to look at the role that has been played by state-level tax cuts over the past decade in terms of their cost, and we think that they are a great concern when it comes to looking at the long-term revenue picture for the state budget. The cumulative impact of these cuts has been pretty significant. These are largely corporate tax changes. Several things happened. Tax rate reductions were enacted into law in 1998 when Governor Tom Ridge was sitting in the governor's mansion, and the value of those tax rate changes has grown dramatically over the course of time. Even back in 2003-4, which is the very first line on the table, the cost of the capital stock and franchise tax, which was a rate cut that was begun in 1998, the value of that has increased substantially over time. additional tax cuts that were enacted under Governor Ed Rendell have also been very costly, and the net result is that in the fiscal year that we're looking to in 2013-14, if no changes are made, the value of those tax cuts in terms of the loss of revenue for the state for that year is over $3 billion. It's about 30% of total education spending. These tax cuts occurred at a time when local governments were raising taxes. Certainly they occurred at a period that was difficult for counties when demands on county human services were going up, and there were state level budget cuts or flat funding for a number of county level services during that period. And these cuts were occurring also at the time when the state was contributing the minimum to its public and school employee pensions. So the arguments made around tax rate reductions are several, and one of them is that they help to generate economic growth. And we know that elected officials don't like to raise taxes and would much prefer to reduce them. The argument again is that it will help with job creation and overall economic growth. Most economists suggest that tax rate changes generate a modest amount of economic growth, and that growth does not pay for itself. Many of you have heard of Arthur Laffer and the Laffer curve and the notion of supply side economics. In fact, most economists have found that that is not the real world experience, that tax rate reductions tend, particularly on the business side, tend to generate somewhere between 25 and 30 cents for every dollar in spending on those cuts, and that economic impact only occurs when there are not at the same time cuts in other critical services, including education, transportation, and public safety, and that if tax cuts are come at the same time as spending cuts in those areas, which are also critical for economic growth, that you can really have you can do more damage than benefit. But we've looked at the impact we've looked actually at Pennsylvania's standing in terms of job creation during the 15-year period, 14-year period since the capital stock and franchise tax rate reduction was enacted. Actually, it's a rate elimination. That tax is scheduled to be eliminated by the end of next year. But our job growth hasn't done particularly well. We ranked 27th in new jobs in 1999-2000, and have actually fallen to 34th in job creation in 2011-12. So what we have now is a budget that is has been proposed for 2013-14 that is about $28.4 billion. It is higher than the budget that was enacted by the General Assembly last year, but even with that proposed budget, state spending is below what it was just before the recession. So in terms of our overall ability to pay for services that the state has provided, there are a number of areas in which we still are well below recession and below the pre-recession levels. And I'm sure you know about many of them. There have been a variety of cuts. General assistance cash grants were cut. We've seen the human services cuts. Literacy programs have taken a big hit. Job training programs, a whole variety of things. So we still haven't caught up in our ability to provide those necessary services. So one of the other things that's included in the governor's tax plan is a new round of business tax cuts, and this has us concerned for the reasons that we have obviously mentioned before, that we've seen the value of those of the already enacted cuts really grow in a manner that I don't think was anticipated when those reductions were planned when the economy was booming in the late 1990s. And the new tax cuts are such that they will cost much more than they will generate in terms of economic growth. And the third concern is that most of the tax cut impact is backloaded. There are some revenue-raising measures in the overall tax plan that the governor's proposed, but they're very, 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 very modest. And in the end, the rate reductions will have a significant impact moving forward, with most of the costs coming after 2018, leaving the next governor really to deal with a situation in which the revenue is much less, and again, helping to create what we think really is a structural imbalance in our state's revenue system. So this is quite problematic, and something that we have to worry about moving forward. So that's really the reason why we're here today, because there are things that can be done to put Pennsylvania on a more sustainable course so that we can continue to grow, but also to continue to keep our faith with our local governments and provide the vital services that are necessary, whether it's in healthcare or certainly in public education. And we haven't talked very much about higher education, but the story for our university system is very much like the story of public education. So a couple of things are going to happen. You probably all know that the governor proposed a budget that's $28.4 billion. That budget was predicated on a surplus from this year and revenue projections for next year that were about 1.8% growth. Since that time, the Independent Fiscal Office has issued its preliminary revenue forecast, and we are looking at a budget that has no revenue from the current year to carry forward, and with revised revenue projections for 2013-14, leaving us in a hole of about $520 million for next year. You know, coming out of the recession, Pennsylvania has in prior years had revenue growth of 5 or 6%. We can't even make it up to 2%, so we're really having some problems there. But there are some things that can be done, and really 3 things that we'd like to propose and get your support for moving forward. One is delaying planned tax cuts and obviously not enacting any new tax cuts. There is a rate reduction that's scheduled for next year, and there has been some talk in Harrisburg about delaying that rate reduction for several years in order to get Pennsylvania through what will probably be 2 more bad budget years. That could raise about $355, $360 million. That talk is is out there about that. Secretary Zogby has said that the administration is looking at it. The Senate leadership has been talking about it, and we will get some signal on whether or not that will happen next week when the House releases its budget bill. But that would certainly go a long way towards closing this budget gap. The second is we need to enact revenue-neutral tax rate reform. This is an administration and our General Assembly that wants to continue to reduce business tax rates. There was a plan to do that, but to do it in a revenue-neutral way, which would include closing corporate tax loopholes, improved enforcement, a number of things that would keep those tax rate reductions from coming at the expense of schools and healthcare and other issues. We have moved away from that principle, but that's certainly something that will help our economy moving forward. And the third thing, and this is one that I really hope that you will take to heart, is that tax rate reductions are not treated the same way as budgetary expenditures are. School districts never know what they're going to be getting from the state. Indeed, you don't really know until well after you have to present and pass your own budgets. But tax rate reductions are enacted into law, and they're very, very difficult to change. The governor's new plan would put in place a phase down of the tax rates, and it requires another vote by the members of the General Assembly in order to prevent those rate cuts from occurring. That's probably what will happen this year if they delay the capital stock and franchise tax. But there's an imbalance there that school districts aren't guaranteed their dollars, but these rate cuts are guaranteed. They're never voted on. The money is taken right off the top in the budget. You never see it. And we think there needs to be parity in the treatment of those two. So let me turn it over to Roberta and Kate to talk a little bit about some opportunities for action in this area, and then we will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Sharon. This is Roberta again. We'd like to import on you the critical time now while the House and Senate are going to move forward on this budget cycle. Sharon's done an excellent job giving you information that should be critical to your ability to advocate on behalf of adequate funding for schools and health and human resources, but as well as to look to the long-term impact on what decisions they make in the current budget year. So Kate, why don't you walk us through this slide on how we can ask the people online to talk about with their legislators, with the legislature, with the governor's office, with their local and municipal area people, their PTOs, anyone that they can speak to support our advocacy on this topic. Kate?
Hi, sorry. I'm Kate Atkins. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Thanks, Roberta. So there are a number of things people on this call can do, and really glad to have you with us today. We know you're already advocating for adequate funding for your own school districts. So the first thing is just it's important to us that people who are making the case for funding for their own schools know that the legislature does have options for preventing cuts and shoring up the state revenue base. So please do download and share this webinar. It's on our website, which is up on your screen. It's pennbpc.org. The second thing is we wanted to invite you all to attend a press conference that we're holding. We're involved with a coalition called Better Choices for Pennsylvania. It's a number of education, healthcare, human services groups who are concerned about state budget cuts. We're holding a press conference for local government officials to talk about the impact of state budget cuts and advocate for alternatives, urge the legislature to delay planned tax cuts so budget cuts are not necessary. That event is Tuesday, June 4th at 1 o'clock in Harrisburg. And if you're interested in attending or would like more information, please email me. My email is on your screen. It's atkins@pennbpc.org. The third piece is obvious. I'm sure you're all already speaking to your state lawmakers. Obviously, those personal conversations are really important, especially for people who are situated as you are, to really know what the impacts are locally of the cuts they're making at the state level. To facilitate that conversation, we'll be sending out an email to you immediately after this call with a formal letter you can personalize and send, and also an e-blast that you can use to send a more informal email. So you'll see that within the next half hour. And the last is please visit our website, betterchoicesforpa.com. There's a sign-on letter up there about this issue, and it's a good place to stay tuned for ongoing advocacy opportunities.
Thank you, Kate. Those are excellent opportunities for us to move forward on our advocacy.